Hello, I'm Adam Keane and I've just finished teaching a retreat at Purple Valley Yoga here in Goa. So just thought I'd take a short opportunity to go through the basic sun salutations in terms of how to stretch in yoga, generally speaking. So I'm using the sun salutations, but be clear that this technique doesn't just relate to sun salutations, it relates to generally stretching in yoga and how that's different to a normal stretch. So just before that, I'm going to introduce you to my lovely wife, Teresa, always the reluctant assistant, nevertheless. I love her. Yeah, the one I have. So how we're often inspired to stretch in yoga, how we're often encouraged to stretch in yoga is the most basic way where we think of a stretch as just stretching out of yourself. So if you imagine that I'm pulling a hand and pulling and pulling and pulling, in the end I'm going to rip the arm, God forbid, out of the socket. But this is often the way that we're encouraged in yoga, just pushing in one direction only. So the stretch is considered as a normal stretch, just stretching out of ourselves. But really, the method of yoga asana is much more interesting because it defines a stretch between opposites, between opposing forces. So whenever you've got a force pushing out of yourself, you've also got a counter force pulling back into yourself. So you're kind of constructing an inner scaffold, an inner tension or a right tension. And tension is part of yoga. We need strength and we need a certain amount of firmness and rigidity even in the body to hold a stretch. Just stretch on its own is really ineffective for purpose, right? So let's look at the sun salutations now before I go on any further, and I'll just show you what I mean here. So every single movement has its opposing force to it. So as she raises the hands, really there's a pulling down of the ribs, so the hands go up, but they're resisted with the pulling in of the ribs and the squeezing apart of the feet, right? So there's in here as well as up here. So it could feel, if I get her to push against my hand here, that there's a resistance she has to do herself pulling in here. And that is different to what you often see, which is simply stretching as far back as possible, which will just take a passive stretch in the shoulders. Yeah, there's no stretch in the back, and what you're always aiming for in yoga is to stretch the back muscles and not just the ligaments and joints, but to mobilize your scapula really. The scapula is really the seat of what we're trying to do, scapular mobility. So raising the hands up, squeezing the heels apart, pulling in here. And it also means a whole body connection, connecting the whole body as one, rather than thinking that you're just raising the arms, you're actually doing something energetically which involves the whole body as one thing. And that's how I would define the deeper context of bandha, in fact. So raising the hands up, and then coming down, exhaling. This movement is interesting because it's the reverse of any kind of lift up and jump back movement. In this case, what you're trying to do is the negative of the handstand press, which is to pull the shoulders upwards and the middle downwards. So what often happens is the whole body gets pulled downwards, but what you're trying to do instead is pull the stomach in, reach the chin, but on the same time kind of pull upwards at the side of the body. Yeah? So you're always utilizing the side of the body against the middle of the body. So it's a very interesting movement and it's worth not glossing over this movement and experimenting with it more. It will help you in the long term. Inhale, look up. At this point, the hands should be on the floor, even if the legs bend. If you can't have the hands on the floor, the hamstrings are a bit tight, bend the legs, because what you're doing is you're pulling forward to the back. So if the hands stay flat, you can stretch the back. If you come up on your fingertips, because your hamstrings are tight, you never get that full pulling with the hand and pulling forward with your back muscles. So she's going back and forth with her hands, pulling the back muscles. And she wants to jump back, so stepping or walking back. I would always suggest, first of all, coming to high plank. Right? You get the shoulder blades and hold the shoulder blades, and now you can pull yourself into low plank, the shoulder blades apart, the heels pressing back. And exhale, come down. And I've been explicitly told not to hold her in chaturanga, so we're going to go through that again one more time to show you how to come from a high plank slowly into a low plank more effectively, because the question is getting that high plank shoulder blades, and then you can effectively pull yourself with the muscles of the back rather than getting a shoulder injury, and this happens all too often. So if you just want to come up to a high plank quickly, fingertip tracks over tracks over fingertip. So there's this shoulder over fingertip line. Yep. Holding the front ribs in, holding the shoulder blades apart, parting the shoulder blades, using the feet. So remember, it's chaturanga, four-limbed position. So pushing back through the heels, sliding down. And if the If the shoulder blades pinch together and the shoulder drops lower than the elbow, then use your knees and come down on your knees. But what you want is to make sure the shoulder blades are pinned apart. So if there's a sense of coming together and dropping low in the shoulder blades, at that point, use your knees for the final bit and come down with a straight chest, and avoid that problem with the shoulder that might come later from overusing this part, because in the chaturanga, you really want to use the back muscles, right? There's often the question of where the alignment should be with the arm. The shoulder stays at the height of the elbow, yep. But the body can come lower than the shoulder and the elbow. The spine can come lower than the shoulder and the elbow, although the shoulder and the elbow stays in one line. So I envisage it like looking forward with a spotlight, shining a spotlight forward, and that keeps the shoulder back and down. Also, the hand position is often a question for many people. Where should the hand be? The more your back is flexible and mobilized, let's say, the further back your hand can be towards the hips. But first of all, I'd secure the hand closer towards the shoulder. It will hold the shoulder more stable. Yeah? Gradually over time, you can put the hand back. And finally, as I mentioned, there's this pushing back through the heels that you get, and use of the legs, which will hold you firmly in chaturanga, four-limbed staff position, holding yourself through the spine by the arms and the legs. So coming into upward dog, there's that slide back, which you already did, and then upward dog. Stay there a second, if you can hold it for a second. So what I suggest in upward dog is really focus on the legs. Although you can't see them, the feet should be slightly closer than the hips. And then what you do is you pull the feet apart. In pulling the feet apart, so pressing the big toes down and pulling across, you get a spreading of the sacrum. What you also do is keep the tailbone tracking back, and what she's then trying to do is pull the breastbone forward. So she's going in opposite directions, tailbone and chest bone, rather than pulling these together. If the elbow rolls outwards here, if the shoulder rolls back and the eyes of the elbows roll internally, the shoulder pushes back and she brings the chest bone towards the tailbone. You don't want that. It's not a back bend, it's a front stretch, trying to make as long arc as you can. So the tailbone is made to go back by the legs, the chest bone is made to go forward by the elbows slightly rolling internally. Ever so slightly, the shoulder stays in its joint and the hands either pull apart or slightly roll internally. Yeah? So the chest bone away from tailbone and using the legs here, really important. And coming to downward dog finally, this is more than just a stretch of your hamstrings, right? The reason you're staying here is to do something with the bandha, the lower abdominal lock, and the breathing together. So you could envisage this different ways, but again, what you're trying to do is get the tailbone away from the chest bone. So that doesn't mean just pushing back into your heels, because that often brings the chest down and the tailbone and chest bone go together. Instead, you could imagine two things. One, on the exhale, pulling the belly in and pulling the mat between the hands and feet, pulling together. It'll make a slight movement at the shoulder blades. You release that on the inhale. The other, on the exhale, reaching over a giant beach ball, reaching over at the hips and over at the armpits on the exhale. But what you want to feel is a movement back and forth at the shoulder blades. Between the inhale and the exhale, there's a minuscule rocking motion with the breath and the stomach engagement that engages the scapula and mobilizes the scapula from the inside out, right? And what you're also, I would suggest to do this, is that the heel stays a tiny bit off the floor. So there's a continuous reaching down through the legs with the tailbone and a forward with the breastbone against that, yeah? And as you step down into the feet, you're pulling one way, and as you reach forward into the hand, you're pulling the other way. But as I said, contradictorily wise, it could also feel like on the exhale, you're putting the hands and feet together. But just so you know, it's more than just a hamstring stretch. You're trying to mobilize the breathing with the stomach lock to make a movement of mobilization at the shoulder blades. And this is the first place you get it. Although it's everywhere in the series, that's the easiest place to find it here first in downward dog. Anyway, she's done downward dog long enough. So stepping forward, we go through the reverse. Keeping the hands on the floor, pulling forward on the inhale and pulling back on the exhale. Even if you need to bend the legs, it's useful to mobilize your scapula. Yep. And then coming up, inhale again, I'll stay down here, and just by the squeezing of the heels apart, the pulling of the front ribs, the hands raise. So again, the action is much lower than just raising the arms up without a whole body connection. So, thank you very much. There's a way. there's a way to do a sun salutation and understand the general principles of the yoga stretch, which is very complicated and very particular, not just stretching out of yourself, but always pulling back towards yourself. And thanks again to Teresa for bearing with me and going through all that.